I didn't see you there. Yes, you look so confused. You don't know why you're here. It seems you're lost. Well, that's not the end of the world. We're all lost once in a while before we find our way again. In the meantime, what should I call you? Excellent. Would you care to stay a while and listen to a story? Not many know it, but it's important nonetheless. Well, good. We need more young people interested in history. So get comfy, grab a cup of cocoa, and off we go. The rain poured on. Never-ceasing buckets dumped down from the heavens, covering the craggy beach. Slade sighed deeply, his breath forming a cloud in front of his face. It was morning. At least, he was pretty sure it was morning. It was certainly less dark than it had been a few hours ago. He shifted his weight slightly and pulled his tattered cloth of a blanket over his legs. His back ached from being leaned up against the rough boulders while he slept. You'd think a place called Devil's Tail would be a lot hotter and a whole lot drier than this, he thought to himself. He wasn't actually sure why it was called Devil's Tail. There were rumors, of course, of monsters and old castles, and terrifying creatures living somewhere in the heart of the mountain range, but Slade doubted it. His skeptical mind doubted everything. Could be true, he thought. Could also be a story to ward off potential treasure hunters. But Slade wasn't a treasure hunter. Oh no. Slade knew the truth of the world. That there's no such thing as treasure hunters. Only thieves. Some of them wanted money. Some wanted trinkets. Others just sought recognition. But to Slade, they were all the same. Reaching out a clawed hand, he fumbled with his pack for a moment before pulling out a crinkled piece of paper. It was old and weathered, and had survived possibly dozens of thieves before Slade. He wasn't totally sure because, of course, he had stolen it. It was a map, but not just any map. Slade possessed an annotated map of the whole continent, with all sorts of notes and leads on treasures he couldn't even begin to imagine. Being careful to shield it from the water that dripped off the end of his whiskers, he spread it out and studied it carefully before glancing down the beach. As he squinted through the haze, his clawed finger instinctively traced the path they'd taken to get there. "Will it be today, Slade?" A voice came from his left. One of his compatriots had finally risen from his slumber. "I think it'll be today, Mac," Slade answered coolly. "Oh, good. We've been walking for days. Me feet hurt, and I'm about ready to go home." "We'll all be home soon, warming up next to the fire in whatever pub we choose, full bellies and all. We just have to get whatever treasure is out here." Slade rubbed his hands together as he spoke. As he began to fold up the map, his eyes lingered on a small note, left by some previous owner. Nearly on top of them now. "The Elven Hold," it read. "Do you think the elves buried their elders here?" Joe, the third in their trio, asked, now seemingly awake as well. "Some say they buried a demon," Mac chimed in. "And some say they buried the lost civilization of the ancients," Slade said, rolling his eyes. "The only thing I'm sure of is that all of those possibilities sound expensive." Climbing to his feet, Slade folded and tucked the map into his pack before pulling it on. "On your feet, you big lugs. It's time to get going." "But the rain," Joe sighed. "It's like a monsoon out here." "It rained all day yesterday. What's one more day?" Slade said flatly, before sternly restating. "Today is the day." He shook his fist for extra emphasis. The two brothers nodded and did as they were told, hoisting their massive forms off the rocky ground and tucking their blankets back into their packs. Slade waited patiently as they tied their green bandanas back onto their bald heads, a sort of ritual they did every day before a big adventure, and today was a big adventure indeed. With all the packs sorted and soggy clothes wrung out as best they could, the trio marched on once more into the downpour. The way going was horrible. As they trudged along, the men's boots sank into the wet sand. at times up to their ankles as the rough sea waters threatened to rise up and take them to a watery grave at any moment. The wind tore at Slade's whiskers, and thunder boomed overhead as his friends did their best to follow in his footsteps. They were physically stronger, there was no doubt, but Slade had an inner strength possessed by very few. Once he set his mind to something, no matter what, he was getting it done. After walking through the maelstrom for what felt like an eternity, Slade caught a glimpse of the final landmark. He felt his heart leap as he laid eyes on 3 boulders barely poking out of the sea, arranged crudely in a triangle. They were quite inconspicuous. You'd never notice them if you weren't looking for them, but Slade was looking for them. "There it is," he squeaked over the wind. "Great!" The brothers shouted in tandem, with great big grins plastered to their drenched faces.
"How do we get it open?"
Mac called out. Slade's stomach dropped. He muttered. "I'm not, sure." He'd been so focused, so honed in on just reaching the spot marked on the map, that he hadn't even considered what came next. But, not one to stand about and wonder, Slade dove headfirst into the sea. The choppy waves pulled him this way and that. The rushing water roared in his ears, but he swam hard against the current, thrashing his legs to propel himself toward the promise of a prize. He lifted his head and gasped for air just in time to see more lightning flash overhead. He could hear Mac and Joe yelling something in the distance, but Slade didn't care. He'd figure this out if it killed him. He kicked and kicked. It felt like the ocean itself was in his way, but finally he brought his head up and saw that the first of the boulders was right in front of him. Trying hard to tread water, he reached out and laid one furry hand on the rock's surprisingly smooth surface. To Slade's amazement, the wind became silent. The choppy waters were still, and the rain that had been belting him for days finally broke. "A spell," he hissed aloud. "Those elves really didn't wish for anyone to find this place." His excitement swelled again. "We are going to be rich." The waves lapped softly at the shore as Slade tossed and turned, the sand somehow always seeming to press up hard against him as he sighed to himself for the umpteenth time tonight. He and his companions had tried in vain the rest of the day to gain access to whatever secret the boulders kept, and it had so far all been for naught. Slade secretly worried that they were actually no closer to the secrets within than they were this morning, but he kept those thoughts to himself as the other men had tried to move one of the boulders for the better part of the day. It just wasn't happening. They were too big and too heavy. Sighing again, Slade opened his eyes and pushed himself into a sitting position. In the light of the full moon, he could see the water glistening off the stones. "Bah!" he mumbled to himself. "I'll show you. I will get inside. I will." He trailed off as he noticed something strange. Out there, over the water, 2 small glistening orbs. Slade rubbed his eyes, begging them to adjust further to the darkness as he squinted into the gloom. It was unmistakable. 2 ice-blue orbs were out there floating between the rocks. He peeled his gaze away to quickly look back at his friends. "Mac, Joe," he called out. But they were gone. Their bedrolls, their packs, there wasn't even an outline in the sand where they'd been sleeping mere moments before. Slade was alone. Looking back to the orbs, he was surprised to see they'd grown bigger. Were still growing bigger. And bigger still. Slade realized too late that the orbs were rushing towards him. He squeaked and tried to climb to his feet, but just couldn't find the strength. As the orbs grew closer and closer, he squeezed his eyes shut tight and waited for the impact, but it never came. He strained his ears, but the only thing he could hear was the slow and steady crash of the waves on the shore. Slade opened his eyes again to see the sun looming overhead. Mac and Joe were already standing, looking out at the stones again. "I think something's happened, boss," Joe called out.
"It looks different."
Mac nodded in agreement. Slade scowled as he pulled himself up. "Well, what are we waiting for, then? Let's go." Outwardly, he was always confident. But today, Slade the thief was anything but. "It's too late to turn back now," he said to himself. "But what have we gotten into this time?" As the trio swam back to the rocks, the water was cool on Slade's skin. He cringed as the salt water found any and every small cut he'd sustained on the journey, and reminded him of each of them. As they drew near to the boulders, Slade could see that things were indeed different than the day before. A large rectangular stone slab had risen to the top of the water. He thought it was somehow floating for a moment before getting close enough to see it was a column of some sort that had risen out of the sea floor. The three were speechless as they approached the slab. Slade moved first to examine the top of it, and was surprised to see it was hollow. Inside, stairs leading downwards, as far as the eye could see, trailing off into darkness. A warm breeze blew across his face from the tunnel. He caught the scent of... what was it? Bad eggs? Scowling, he shrugged it off and chalked it up to air escaping that had long been stagnant. Slade lifted himself out of the water and onto the edge of the pillar, the water rolling down his pant legs and continuing down the smooth stone staircase, like little iridescent beads. Whatever the elves had put here, they'd put a lot of effort into hiding it, and Slade knew that meant a big payday, as long as you knew the right people. "Are we really going down there?" Joe asked apprehensively. "Did we come all this way not to?" Slade shot back. However, a small flame of doubt had flickered into his mind. As he removed the torch from his bag, and light began to dance about the flat stone walls, he hoped this wasn't some horrible mistake. The trio began their descent down the long stairs as they were swallowed up by the darkness, pausing only as often as the stairs changed direction. Further and further they went into the abyss. Slade crinkled his nose as the rank smell grew stronger the farther down they got. Oil? He wondered. He still couldn't be sure. The smooth stairs seemed to go on forever. He wasn't quite sure how long they'd been walking, how many hours it had been. Mac had tried to sing for a time, but had long ago fallen silent as the men focused on keeping their footing down the long corridor. It went without saying that a fall down these stairs would mean certain death. Even if you managed to somehow merely injure yourself, there was no way anyone could carry a body back up as far as they'd come. Finally, the stairs began to level out, and the party came to a dark room. The room stretched at least as far as Slade's rat eyes could see, which, in the gloom, admittedly, wasn't very far.
"Are we there?"
Mac asked cautiously. Slade lifted the torch high, but it did little to illuminate the gloom. "I'm not sure," he said, his eyes straining to see anything. "Slade!" Joe called out from somewhere in the darkness. He'd wandered along the wall a few steps, and Slade made his way over with the torch. "What is it?" "Look here," Joe said, gesturing to the wall. Slade brought the torch close to see several long gouges carved into the stone, jagged and uneven, like a large bear had scratched at it. But Slade knew a bear couldn't cut that deeply into stone.
Guys?"
Mac's voice called out from behind. There was a small ticking sound. Slade whirled around to see two red orbs glowing softly in the distance, growing steadily larger. Slade," Joe whispered. "I see it," Slade said, waving his hand. "I just don't know." His voice trailed off as a blue light came into focus just below the red ones. It started just as dim, but got brighter, and brighter, and brighter.
"Robot!"
Mac yelled as he dove for cover just in time. The blue light exploded as a thin beam arced across the chasm's chiseled floor. Slade and Joe fell to the ground as the blistering light scraped along the walls above their heads with a horrible squealing sound. Just as quickly as it started, it stopped. The beam trailed off, leaving smoldering particles still in the air, flitting about like burning snowflakes as they cooled from a dark blue to a smoking orange. The robot's crimson eyes lowered to the floor. The sound came again. Metal on rock, Slade realized, as it echoed across the cavern, and the eyes drew rapidly nearer. Slade pushed himself up, whipping the knife off his belt, and dropped low into a fighting stance. He'd never fought something quite like this. But he was no stranger to booby traps and treasure caves. Surely they could overcome this, too. Joe bellowed out, giving voice to Slade's own thoughts. The elves really don't want this thing disturbed. There was no time to answer, as Slade hurled his torch toward the approaching figure. Just before it made contact, the eyes jerked upwards. The robot flung itself high into the air. At the corner of his vision, Slade saw Mac charge forward, sword drawn, steel glinting in the torchlight. There was a loud clang as he brought the tip of his sword down hard on the robotic figure, followed by a low thunk, and Mac crying out. Joe moved fast, but the robot moved faster, wheeling out of the way of his axe, which slammed into the cave floor. Slade rolled forwards and hurled a knife in the robot's direction, but it ducked under, nearly flattening its body before quickly rising back to its full height. Slade gasped as it slithered forward, almost snake-like. He reached for another knife, ready to meet his fate, when Mac again charged forwards and grabbed the robot's metal frame, lifting it high into the air. The robot jerked this way and that as Mac slammed it into the floor. There was a loud bang and sparks shot off it in all directions. Mac brought it down, again and again, as the thing let out a horrible electronic warble before finally falling silent. But Mac didn't stop. With a horrible yell, he threw down the metal figure and took after it with his sword, hitting it over and over, until Joe finally reached him and grabbed his arm. Slade was paralyzed. He could hardly move as Joe strode over to retrieve the torch. Mac's shoulder had a deep gash, and blood began to pool at his feet, as he tried to steady his ragged breathing. "Easy, brother," Joe said, removing his bandana. He tied it tight around Mac's shoulder. Slade kicked himself. He kept meaning to grow stronger, but every time they got into a fight, it was always one of the brothers who saved the day, and now Mac was badly hurt. Slade felt guilty that he couldn't protect them. He couldn't fight all the battles alone. He couldn't let them know this, of course. It had ruined his image. But he cared for his friends deeply.
It'll be fine.
Mac wheezed softly.
Let's just finish this. Shake it off, Slade.
Snapping out of his daze, Slade knelt down to examine the fallen automaton. In the flickering light of the torch, he could see its spindly arms and legs, now motionless. It looked almost skeletal. The thing was terrifying to look at. As the lights in its eyes ebbed away, Joe gasped somewhere further in the chamber. Slade glanced up and couldn't believe his eyes. There in the wall was another carving. This one not made by the robot. Probably. On the wall were intricate carvings of what looked like elves. Tons of elves, probably a whole village. But one elf stood above the rest, his arms raised, lightning protruding from his fingertips. The rest of the elves looking up at him with a mix of admiration and horror. Slade wasn't sure what to make of it. "Let's just keep moving," was all he could think to say. At the end of the room was another corridor. 2 altars filled with oil on either side of the door. Joe touched them both with the torch and set them alight. A path of flaming embers moved down the narrow corridor, illuminating the room as it went. The fire traced intricate designs all along the walls before coming to an end at the top of a few more stone stairs. "End of the road," Joe remarked. Mac gaped behind them.
What is it?
Not a what? Slade couldn't believe it. It's a who? As the trio entered the corridor, they were able to see what was at the end of the room. At the top of the last stairs, hanging from all sorts of wires, was a man. An elf. He was beautiful. He had regal and handsome features, and vibrant pink hair. His skin was darker than most elves, and that skin was adorned with scarlet tattoos that almost seemed to glow.
What do we do?
Mac sounded almost frantic. I don't know. Slade could only look on in awe of the man. He's wearing gold, Joe huffed. Sure enough, the elf's wrists and ankles sported intricate golden bangles with something scrawled on them. Elvish, Slade assumed. Let's get them off, then. Slade grinned and grabbed at the golden anklet closest to him. It's not very tight. This should be a cinch, he said as he tugged at it, but it remained still. Frowning, Slade leaned in to get a closer look. It's definitely not too small for him. It should slide right off. Is there a clasp of some sort? Slade examined the trinket, but there was no such luck. Squaring his shoulders, Slade planted his feet, once again taking hold of the treasure, and he pulled hard. He pulled until he saw white and his back threatened to give out, but alas, the gold remained in place around the elf's ankle, which hadn't budged an inch. "I can't even spin it in place," Slade called out.
We don't even know why he's here.
Mac protested. "I bet he'll tell us if we free him." Slade shot back as he removed the knife from his belt and began sawing at the wires that were connected to the elf. "He'd probably even be willing to give us a reward for saving him." "As impulsive as ever," Joe chuckled before pulling out his own small blade and going to work on the wires connected to the elf's golden wrists. "We've come this far. We may as well hear what he has to say." Slade chopped at one of the wires connected to the elf until it became frayed and began to spark, shooting off into the darkness, and still he sawed at it with all his remaining might. While cutting, he tugged and pulled until finally, with one last big jerk, the wire came off in his hand, the end of the exposed cable sparking wildly with power and writhing like a tiny snake. Slade held it up triumphant when something caught his eye. He thought for a moment that the elf's face had twitched. He jumped as it happened again. And then again. The elf opened his eyes, a pale icy blue that appeared to gaze out into nothingness. Slade gasped and jumped down. The elf blinked a few times before looking down and regarding the trio. His face remained expressionless as the rest of the wires connected to his body began to glow a brilliant orange before falling away. Some of them dropped to the floor, now liquid, while others stretched and hung from the ceiling, melting into some kind of thin metal stalactites. It was the most powerful blaze magic the three men had ever seen. Before they could say anything, a shockwave rippled through the cave, emanating out from the angelic figure in front of them. Slade's yell caught in his throat as his whiskers were blown back. He squeezed his eyes shut tight until the air had settled. When he finally opened them again, his blood ran cold. The elves' chilling blue eyes were fixed on his, as if they could see right through him. Years of quick-thinking negotiations kicked in, however, and his mouth began forming words faster than his mind could think of them. "Hello, sir. We happen to be in the area, just taking a little stroll, and, well, we saw you, me and the boys, and thought, that looks like a man who could use some help. That's what we said, right, boys?" Mac and Joe nodded furiously as the elf's gaze shifted to them for a moment. "See?" Slade said, raising his arms in a friendly gesture. "We're just a couple of do-gooders out helping people." The elf laughed softly. His voice was sweet like honey. "Where are we?" he asked, squinting.
Somewhere under the water at the Devil's Tail, I suspect,"
Slade answered. The elf seemed to think for a moment. "Do you know of Vulcanon?"
"The bird thing?"
Slade wasn't quite sure what Vulcanon had to do with anything. "So I haven't been asleep for too long." The elf nodded knowingly. "And what of the Elven village? How are my people getting on?"
"Where would that be?"
As far as Slade knew, no such village existed. There were rumors, sure, but nothing more. "Interesting." The elf nodded again. "So some things have changed greatly." "Who are you?" Joe asked, finally finding his voice.
Why are you here?
Mac echoed. The elf man moved forward from the space he'd occupied for who knows how long, and gracefully floated to the floor. "I am called Pazort, and I am here because the elvish leaders are small-minded and gullible."
"I don't understand,"
Slade said flatly. "I have a great many things to do," Pazort said as he began to flex his rippling muscles. "I've already been asleep for far too long. I have much to set right."
"What will you do?"
Slade asked, remembering the gold in the equation and eyeing it questioningly. Pazort took notice. "Do you want this?" he asked, removing the golden bracelets that now hung off him.
"We've come a very long way."
Slade already knew that there was no way to take the gold from him if he didn't want to give it up. "Symbols of my oppression," Pazort said angrily, removing one of the bracelets and dropping it to the floor. He paused a moment before fiddling with the ankle rings as well. Finally, he took off the last bracelet and handed it to Slade, pressing it firmly into his hands. I won't forget this, he said before adding with a smile. The elves won't forget this either. And with that, the elf turned and strode into the darkness, back the way the party had come. Something about the way he'd said that last bit had bothered Slade, but it was too late to change things now. Keep pushing forward, he reminded himself as he eyed the glittery treasures. The great thief Slade has done it again.